recently elected chair of the Council on Aging, and I'm here to welcome you to the annual Francis P. and Mary J. Brennan Lecture Series. We have been fortunate to have the Brennan family fund this lecture for the past, I think it's 13 years now. The lecture started in 2001, and after Mary's death in 1997. Frank passed away in 2010, and their children continued their support. Mary and Frank, both from Somerville, were longtime residents of Winchester. You all received a brochure with a lot of information about their dedicated contributions to work and the community. We are honored to have two of their children here tonight, Mary Ann Newcomb and Tom Brennan. Where are you guys? Somewhere way in the back there. We really, really thank you for your continued support. As our speaker tonight, we welcome a Winchester resident, Peter Cutler, president of Cambridge 7 Associates, architectural firm. Peter probably does not need much of an introduction to many of you who are familiar with this firm's projects in the Boston area, such as the Boston Children's Museum and the renovation of the New England Aquarium and the Museum of Science. Peter's firm also has an extensive international portfolio, which brings us to his topic for this evening, today's museums in a global culture. For this lecture, Peter will speak about his works on museums, and particularly the intersection of museums and culture in a global practice. He will balance insights from his work overseas with updates on the recent and upcoming growth of museums in Boston. A Boston Globe article once described Peter as the people's architect. Peter is quoted as saying, "All of our projects are public, no speculative office buildings, no private homes. A lot of our work is concerned with how large groups of people have an experience." So it's time, I think, for you to continue with this and speak for yourself, and I'll stop speaking for you. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank the committee. And I don't actually know everybody on the committee who sorts all of this out, but thank you for inviting me. I've been working in both academic and museum design for about 35 years. And what's really impressed me is the power of informal learning, the way we learn informally outside of the classroom and as we go through our lives. And it's a lot of the museum innovations that came first from here in Boston that first brought me here and my family. Tonight, I've sort of broken it up into these four areas here. I want to touch on the current state of museums here in Boston. There's been some growth, and it's starting to steamroll. Hopefully you're aware of some of them, but maybe you're not all. I'll go online and grab some images of those. Then I wanted to talk about our early learning experience with the Boston Museums at Cambridge 7 Associates and how we learn from our clients. And then talk a little bit about how we're now exporting the kinds of things that Boston innovated into the rest of the world. Boston's special in the country for a lot of reasons. Richard Florida, who wrote The Rise of the Creative Class, makes the case that nowadays our cultural institutions don't come following business investments. It's the other way around today. People want to live and work and start their businesses where there's a creative economy, where there's culture there, and it's the museums and colleges here in Boston that create that. He actually created this creativity index, and I was very impressed. Of the 50 cities above 1 million people, Boston ranks number 3rd in the country in terms of creativity, and I think that ripples through a lot of what happens in our cultural and academic endeavors here. This is a quote: "Real museums are places where time is transformed into space." This is Orhan Pamuk. He's a Nobel laureate author. He wrote The Museum of Innocence, and what fascinated me was as he wrote this book about the Museum of Innocence, he created a brick and mortar museum of innocence in Istanbul. And he goes back and forth between the real world of the museum and the world of literature. And his quote touches on that power of the museum to informally teach. We have 25 major museums that are in this list that I got recently in terms of their attendance here in Boston. These are the top 25. And this is a typical month in 2010. It's a little hard to read, but 870,000 people visit museums in a typical month. In 2010 wasn't a great time in the economy either. If you multiply that by 12, that means about 10 million people visit museums in a year in Boston. That's more, I'm told, than all the sports teams together in Boston. So it really is a powerful way for people to get together, for community to form, and to share ideas. I took the trouble of sorting it by attendance, and what you see is the big three really. It's very disproportionate. The Museum of Science, the Aquarium, and the MFA have the bulk of that visitation. And then the next group is, I'm not sure we call this a museum, but the Duck Tours, the Boston Children's Museum, and Old North Church are the next cluster. And although they look like considerably down, that's 500,000 people each come to those museums each year. So it's a kind of exciting round of museums here who are generating a lot of new ideas. Boston's also good at providing a wide range of types. I have sorted museums from, when I'm going from A to A. Art on one hand and animals on the other. This is probably the widest spectrum, and there's a whole range now of specialty museums that evolved in between. History museums, nature, any number of special focus points. And probably the biggest trend is museums that have a dedicated story, a real focus on what they're doing. But what I would like to do, these are distributed around the city physically as well. So we're not a city with a park that has all the museums in it, like Philadelphia or something like that. Our museums are spread out around the city. The big three, the MFA, the Gardner, and the ICA, are kind of the pioneers here. They're the biggest at engaging in the last 5 years, the philanthropic community. And they actually bring the outer world to Boston. They bring collections from all over the world to us for the edification of Boston. Then there are those ones that tell our story. This is a whole host of smaller museums in the, actually can the light be turned off in this front, or is it all or nothing? Is it all or nothing?
Would you speak closer to the microphone?
Yes, I'll do that. So it's these museums that celebrate our own story here in Boston and tell that story to us. It's very much a Revolutionary War story to a large extent, but it's wonderful because it makes the city a living museum itself. Across the river in Cambridge, Harvard's Museum of Natural History, the Fogg, and the MIT Museum take a different approach, a very academic approach to museums, but it adds to the flavor of what we have going on here. And then finally, there are these specialty museums like the Science Museum, the Aquarium, JFK Library, the Zoo. These are the museums where a lot of our work is focused in Boston, but they're ones that tell special stories that are partially local and partially global, and an important part of the whole cast of experiences that we have available to us here. So I want to touch now on some other people's projects first, only because they're significant and they affect the way things happen here. And there's been a recent growth. The first three I mentioned, the art museums, are the ones we'll start with here. That's a building type we essentially imported from Europe. The art museum has been around forever. It is essentially an empty shell that's waiting for curators to tell a whole host of stories that change over time. It's a very, very particular kind of a building. They were the first to mobilize for growth. They were the first to start raising money in the past decade, and became an example for other museums that it was indeed still possible to raise money and to grow. So the first one that kind of started the whole thing, and the first new museum in many years, was the ICA. They made a big, brash move to leave Boylston Street, which their old place is now the new home for the Boston Architectural College, and Jill Medvedow moved them all the way down to the seaport. It was a pretty brave move. It's an empty piece of land. It's a little more populated now than this aerial photograph, but they bravely were essentially committing to anchor this new space of development on the waterfront. She also did something else that was relatively brave. She hired a New York architectural firm, Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, who really hadn't done a major building before. They taught, they were theorists, so this was a chance to put their theories into practice. Other than their contractor going bankrupt, it was an interesting experiment. It did a lot of new things. It's bold, it's different, it's a very different architecture appropriate for the waterfront. It was also the first of many new buildings to really turn their front to the water and engaging the new harbor walk, which is being completed all across the edges of the waterfront. So it's really a new standard. It sets a design standard, a high bar, I think, for that area there. A very exciting, dramatic front to the water. Inside, the other thing it's done is quite more radical, is that they've tripled the amount of space they had in that old building on Boylston Street, and they put it all on one floor, so they have maximum flexibility for the shows that they present and the stories they tell. But they've also led the way in bringing light into the museum, bringing natural light into the art museum environment. Obviously, there's a lot of issues with the art itself, but it makes for exciting spaces and a wide variety of spaces there. The second one, and the one that started raising money long before that, was the MFA, the Grand Dame of Museums here. For years, they dominated the fundraising scene. A lot of other people just hesitated because they were asking for more money than all the other museums together at one point in time. Also, in the same way that that's my grandson. In the same way that that we imported the European building type, both the kind of architecture and the art museum itself, we began to import European architects as well. So the MFA brought the English firm Norman Foster and Partners. Malcolm Rogers did, in fact, raise $504 million for the new wing, which was twice anything in the past. So it worked, and I think the architectural firm contributed to the ability to raise that money. One of the great things they did was restoring the old entry on Huntington Ave. The original MFA had opened in Copley Square for the nation's bicentennial on the 4th of July in 1876. But in 1909, he moved to this building and slowly began to grow. And the architects restored that historic tradition of the grand front door to the museum. At the same time, they also brought up the recurring conversation about modern architecture and traditional architecture. They don't ape the original architecture. They have a new kind of architecture that meets its own terms. It's a major insertion of a simple glass box in one of the old courtyards. But it's been quite successful, and it's totally transformed the way people use the museum as well as the spaces available. They, too, even more than the ICA, welcomed in daylight. And so these are pictures where you can see into the building, you can see patrons who are circulating in the building, and they've also created light-filled circulation spaces, a light-filled atrium in it. So this is a very dramatic change from the black box museum of times past. And then the third of the big three, and the most recent to open, was the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. They complete the trio. When Ann Hawley started here, basically her first few days on the job, the major art theft happened. So she started really kind of in the hole, but I think it's capped with this expansion, which has been very celebrated, dealing exactly with some of the same issues that Foster did. She went to Europe as well. Renzo Piano is the celebrated Italian architect who came and has worked on museums across the country. Like Foster at the MFA, his insertion is modern. His is bigger than the original, and so the relationship is different. But he has a whole new face. The longer edge of the property now is this new face. Also, like Foster at ICA, they worked a lot with light and transparency. You can see circulation, you can see people moving between galleries. You can see it sort of buffering the darker visitor experience with the very light public experience. The other thing they did was literally generate some new kinds of spaces that don't exist before. There are two very special spaces, one for performance, one for gallery. This is the gallery space. The walls move, the floor changes, the ceiling will go up and down for different heights. So it's a very flexible space. At the same time, they're still celebrating the classic old spaces, the courtyard spaces, and the gardens. The thing that made the Isabella Stewart Gardner special and unique, very minimal connection between the two, and let each stand on their own strength. So those are really the three museums that started it all, that have made all the other museums start thinking about new ways to address their public, the visitor services, new stories to tell. There's also a couple under construction right now that I thought people might be interested in hearing a little more about. One is the JFK Library at Columbia Point. It still is they're growing as a complex. The Mass State Archives are here, as well as the JFK Library. This is the original building that IMK produced that sits proud on the point there, and is in fact the kind of anchor for this whole development. This is slightly different in that the campus is now including the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. So his brother will have a comparable museum with exhibits and visitor center as well as archives, but in a lower and more modest building. It's not a wing per se, but another addition to the campus there. They have also brought in an international architect. This is Rafael Vignoli. He is an Uruguayan, although he went to school and spent a long time in his practice in Argentina. And he's the one that did the new convention center down in the Seaport area. So he's been working on this project. And as you can see, unlike the modern insertions in the Gardner and the MFA, this is a building very in keeping with Pay's very simple sculptural, simple geometric shapes that expand the space. And the other one that I pass by every day on the way to work is the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard. The Fogg opened in 1985. It's the oldest museum at Harvard. It's part of a bigger complex of art museums that are starting to be realigned and rearranged, and several are merging together as they consolidate their holdings and bring in new staff. They've also engaged a European. Renzo Piano is also doing this, the architect of the Isabel Stewart Gardner. He's keeping very much a somewhat modest space on Quincy. The old existing building, the Shepley Bulfinch building, is essentially staying the same, and the scale at the edges is similar. And this is one of the key renderings which manages to hide the fact that they may be, as far as I can tell, almost tripling the size of the building. But they have a major skylight lantern that looks very transparent and simple up there as it grows out of the top, and on the back is another wing. If you look at it from the air in this construction photo recently, there's an entire new building on the back. The Sackler across the street is going to stop being used as a museum, and so that whole collection is coming into the building. Some of the other ones are being consolidated here, as well as labs, conservation spaces, and things like that. So although it looks like a giant skylight on the top of it, only the part on the right is actually a skylight. The back part is glass-encased labs and offices with sophisticated louvers to make sure they don't overheat in what appears to be a classic skylight lantern. And a little hard to read, but this is a section through the building. The Quincy Street part is to the left. Then everything on the right, which is essentially 5 stories of new space, is being added on the right side there. There will be this dramatic 5-story atrium in the center of the building. So when you come into the old Italianate courtyard, that's roughly 3 stories high now, it will extend up to this new skylight high above. So it is pretty exciting. Fogg is different than the other museums. They don't live for tickets or visitors. They live for their collections, but it's worth visiting. And I think they are very sincere in wanting more people to use them. So that, to me, is sort of the big players in the city and the things that are going on now that set the environment for what's going on. I want to talk a little bit about our own experience at Cambridge Southern Associates and how we learned from our museum clients and from their own innovations. This was our first job back in 1962. This was the Boston waterfront in the 60s when the aquarium was coming up. And there was absolutely nothing else there. It was essentially free land, and nobody went to the waterfront. So there were a lot of visionary people committed to an aquarium. They were a spin-off of the Museum of Science and decided to have their own aquarium here. And it really transformed the waterfront. And this, for a lot of towns, came to Boston to study. This aquarium was a catalyst for development there. Baltimore, all across the country and other parts of the country saw it not just as a cultural addition to the city, but also as a business catalyst. At the same time, this was a new thing. This was the first of the new generation of aquariums. Prior to that, it had been like a classic art museum. You just happened to have fish in those frames instead of Monets. So that was quite different. This was the inside, and on day one, it was the first time that a museum experience had become immersive. And that word immersive is now constantly used in the museum world, that you left your world behind and you disappeared in the world of the ocean. You felt like you were underwater. You weren't in classic architecture. You were in the ocean in some way interpreted for you. So they were pioneers and are always credited as being the first of the world-class new generation of aquariums. A second client we had in those early days was the Boston Children's Museum. At that point in time, known as the Children's Museum. They were the second oldest in the country. They were the most innovative, so you didn't need to say Boston. It was just the Children's Museum. This is their site at the time. You see in red the old Victoria Station that was down there, and essentially parking out in front of this old wool warehouse. We had been working with them since the 60s when they were in Jamaica Plain. And they had a very significant director, Michael Spock, who was the son of Dr. Spock. And Michael was the first director of essentially a collections museum to put up a sign that says, "Please touch." Took all the cabinets off, invited kids to play with things, and before you knew it, they were inventing interactive exhibits, they were inventing hands-on play focused. And so it started a revolution. And he's still alive, and he's being honored. This year is the 100th anniversary of the Children's Museum, and a book about his experience in inventing the modern Children's Museum. So it was great to be in the city and have a client who was inventing the paradigm for this kind of building. And then this was the building when they first moved down to the old warehouse. It was considered a real breakthrough when they moved into the center of Boston. It became a museum for all the city. Though you will notice on this drawing, most of the windows are boarded up. It was not a safe part of the city, but it was exciting to be accessible by all of the people in the city. And this is the kind of large-scale hands-on space that they created there. A 3-decker house with a side-off so kids could role play inside of it. They could really engage with the play activities, but it was also telling a story about Boston itself. And then the third one in our sort of seminal projects was working for the Museum of Science. And this is what the dam looked like in 1949, and you see construction has just started there. Also in this case, Brad Washburn was a brash young mountain climber who had just taken over the Museum of Natural History that used to be in the old Brooks Brothers building, and decided to move it here and change the name to the Museum of Science, which opened in 1951. At the time, there were 3 small buildings: the Natural History Building, an Hayden Observatory, and the Theater of Electricity. Over time, that has grown with 8 additions into one big conglomerate of a museum. We started working with them in the late 80s, early 90s. This was the Current Science and Technology exhibit. What they did that was fundamentally different than other science museums was say, here's the phenomena, let you understand the phenomena, but also let visitors become the scientists themselves. That they could engage, they could interact with these science experiments and whatever. So this was fundamentally important and came out of Boston. Today they are always considered one of the top 10 in the world. From an attendance point of view, they're the 6th most visited science museum in the world. So they are leaders in the field, and you know, it's an honor to work with 3 kinds of institutions like this, and it makes you proud to be in Boston where these innovations keep continuing. This is the kind of interactivity that they engage with and that they talk about. And the real thing is, while the art museums are importing these buildings from Europe in the kind of sense that European sensibility and European architects, it's these specialty museums that are being exported around the world. And for us, it started with aquariums, a very difficult technical type. And so these are several of our aquariums that we've done in the past several years in different parts of the world. So other countries are looking to the United States, and Boston in particular, as a place that innovates in aquariums, innovates in this idea of the science museum, and introduced the idea that such a thing as a children's museum might even exist. This was our first overseas aquarium, and this was in Osaka. And as we began to work overseas, we were very aware that there were a lot of cultural differences that we were going to learn about. There was a movement, kind of a reaction against the modernist American buildings being built, particularly in the Middle East, with ignoring the local culture, and so we became very sensitive about that. One of the first things we do, because these are the kind of museums that actually tell a specific story, is find that story. And for Osaka, it was this ring of fire that surrounds the Pacific. They're in a unique position on this tectonic plate, and there's very unique life forces in the warm water that follows the ring of fire around it. So we designed the entire building using this story of Japan's position on the ring of fire and taking you on that trip that Japanese fishers take and the Japanese explorers over time have taken. This was our largest aquarium at the time, over 1 million gallons, and this is the first time a whale shark was actually ever a part of one of the major tank exhibits in it. So it had gone from 200,000 gallons at Boston to 1 million gallons here. Another one we did in Europe, just to get even, if you will, is at Genoa for the 1992 celebration of Christopher Columbus, and Spain was managing the World's Fair. Genoa was a little upset and did their own World's Fair. And we worked with Renzo Piano, so it was a nice treat to share there. Here we started looking at the history of Italy and the history of the Mediterranean. So this became our first aquarium where animals and culture coincided with each other, literally specimens of each. And you talked about how the history was shaped by the life on the water and how being a coastal Mediterranean country affected both the life in the water, the quality of the Mediterranean, and history there. And some of our exhibits were even things like a habitat that isn't a natural habitat. This is an old Roman wall that's left in the Mediterranean, and we would develop habitats that would naturally evolve and talk about how man's history over time and natural habitats fit together. And then still in the aquarium vein, but now moving into the Children's Science Museum, this is the Scientific Center in Kuwait, which includes both an aquarium and a children's museum. Here we use a very different kind of an architecture, and we actually looked at some of the local references. What's special about Kuwait is the land-based Bedouins intersect with the Persians who ply the ships, the dhows, in the Persian Gulf. And so this is a much more cosmopolitan city than most other parts of the Middle East. And so we used the tent shapes to shield light from heat gain in the inside of the building and the circulation. And we used tents all around the space and inside as well. This is the public face of the aquarium and children's museum, and this is the children's museum side, where besides the activities inside the children's museum, we got very involved with local craftsmen and invented activities. So inside you could find out how you build a dhow, and then you come out through actually a cave out onto the waterfront, and these 4 small dhows are actually quarter-scale dhows, kid-sized dhows, so the kids can actually go into the boats. And this is it appears to be a bay of the Persian Gulf, but it's actually only 18 inches deep. So it's a kind of play area. And then just off the picture to the left is a real historic dhow that was being restored in place while the museum was operating. And volunteers would come during the day and do that. Inside, we modified classic children's museum play, sandboxes, things like that, to have an Islamic feel and to tie closer to culture. So these were telling stories about the land with caves and sand and archaeological dig playing, as well as talking about water. This is learning how to pack a dhow for a trade. The 7 simple machines were very much an Islamic invention, and so we celebrate those kinds of things here. Now we're in the children's world, and while aquariums got us around the world because we understand the tricky technology of keeping the animals alive, with children, it's because we understand the tricky keeping the children engaged. And so that story is very different. And our first overseas one after Kuwait then was in Seoul, Korea, where they had a competition, and another Italian architect, not Renzo Piano, did the building itself, and then we started telling the stories inside. One of the first things we learned was they wanted to base this museum on fables and fairy tales, and almost all of them involved being swallowed by a tiger. So we learned a lot about fairy tales in Korea, and we created spaces that had historic houses, so they could, even though the real effect here is play, the idea is you'd be playing in the context of your traditions and in the context of your history. So this is a series of folklore stories with the historic house, which is actually a tiny planetarium underneath, so you can see the sky above and learn the story about some children who flew off and became constellations. As well as some more classic stories about being in the ocean and what have you, that are more classic fairy tales. And then finally creating small towns and country where you can play and be in the safety of the Children's Museum, but actually begin to pretend and role play you're in the real world. So some classic American Children's Museum kinds of activities at play, but translated into a Korean background. So I have a couple that we have underway right now. And the first is in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, and I had put a couple of the pictures up there. But this is the King Abdullah Financial District, and they're building a brand new town. It's got about 70 high-rise towers. About half of them are office and half of them are condominium space. And at some point in time, some Canadian planners told them they should have some museums. So they quick raced around to add museums to it, and they gave us 3 of them. An aquarium in the center there, and what we're now calling Geosci, which is a technology museum and a nature center, which we have combined together. So I'm just going to show a little of the design approach we took here and talk about how we got to where we're going. And they're just now going out to bid for construction. The last week, the Science Center, and next week, the aquarium. So the idea here was we sort of find a story for the aquarium. And the idea here was that Saudi Arabia, actually, the peninsula is an island. It's its own tectonic plate in terms of global tectonics. And there, in every direction, there's a different body of water, from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, to the Red Sea, to the Persian Gulf. So all of these habitats are unique and separate around it. So we're telling that story of Saudi as an island and its immediate surroundings. But the trip also includes comparing the Saudi Arabian environment with other extreme environments in the world. Because the desert in itself is such an extreme environment, there are huge similarities between how life evolves in a desert, in the Arctic Circle, and in the very depths of the ocean, where the number of species is minimal. They develop very hardy and specific ways to deal with the extreme conditions, and any climate change actually is much more fatal in those environments. So we're comparing the desert to the Arctic, and we're also contrasting it with the rainforests of the world. So we're looking at plenty and we're looking at sparse environments, but always coming back to their own hometown. And this is an aerial perspective of the building itself. There's a depressed pedestrian area to the left of it. There's skyways. There's a monorail that connects it all. So it's part of a kind of very engaging new cityscape they're hoping to make. The building itself has 2 rainforests on the roof, one from Brazil and one from Indonesia. And then as you approach the building, it's wrapped in screens, essentially, to help us keep the heat out of the building, trying to do a green building. And the little gaps are video LED panels that allow us to have videos of animals who are in the main tank projected on the outside of the building. And then this is the atrium space, and the last big area in the center. You go to the top of the building, you visit the rainforest, you descend through, and you pop out, and you're looking at the Arabian Sea. So that's sort of the design process, how we kind of meld that story and the architecture and the interior exhibits together to reinforce it. Almost all of our aquariums are a sort of single guided trip. They're almost a film, if you will. There's a beginning, a middle, and end, a climax with the ocean tank, and presumably we engage you and we give you a kind of love for the environment when you end. Very different approach when we put together a science museum. So this is the science museum process we went through on the Geosci Center. And in a science museum, like a real scientist, you go wherever you want. We dump you in the door and you explore what you're interested in. Everybody goes in different directions, they have different amount of time they spend on things. And so that's a very different pattern in how you lay out a building and how you work with the people. One of the things that they're quite proud of there was that in the Dark Ages in Europe, a lot of the learning from Egypt, from Rome, and from Greece was essentially lost everywhere except in the libraries of the Middle East. So in the 12th and 13th centuries, that was the repository of most learning. They were quite progressive at the time. There was a lot of advances in medicine and mathematics. Words like algebra are Islamic. So we wanted to start with those stories. So the idea was we would always introduce every gallery with a historic portal and tell the story of the role the Middle Eastern scientists and researchers and philosophers played in that, and then move into the bigger contemporary story. The other thing which was a definitely a Middle Eastern concept, was alchemy, another Arabic word. So we actually have organized the museum on this story of alchemy. That we have a floor of fire, a floor of earth, a floor of water, and a floor of air. It's a novel, disproved kind of science, but it was a huge part of that early struggle with defining the world around us and phenomena we had. And so why not celebrate it, look at it, see why it was a real part of science, and then take it apart. So the idea was we organized the building this way, but before you went into each of these buildings, you'd come to the yellow lobby, and then you would go wherever you wanted, earth, fire, water, air, but you would go through a historic portal, find out where you are. The other thing is our site is in a part of Saudi Arabia where the old riverbed went through, which is why Riyadh is where it is. It's referred to as the Wadi. It's a dried riverbed, maybe 3 or 4 days a year, water reappears. And if you dig down under there, you find crystals where the rock and the deposits have crystallized. So the idea for the architecture here was to reflect that kind of crystallized shape that would come out of the Wadi. So this became the Geoclimate Center as our new name for the Nature Center, and the Science Museum is the Technology Center. Now, one of the things we're trying to do with each of these is telling both of these stories together. They call this recessed walkway down the middle the Wadi. It's roughly where the Wadi used to be. And so it's recessed 20 feet into the ground, it's planted more heavily, and it's slightly air conditioned. They can afford that, I suppose, in Saudi Arabia. So it's a cool outdoor space, and it protects you from the city above. Keep traffic up at the upper level and people down at the lower level. So this is as you, and of course water features always help with mist and cooling. This is the approach to the entry to the geoclimb on the right, on the left, and the Science Museum beyond. Essentially a 3-layer glass skin that protects the whole thing from an insulation point of view, with an inner layer of metal louvers that keep the sun from being able to go directly into it. Each one has an internal atrium. One is full of technology, the other is full of nature, this 3-story space, and there are actually large-scale interactives that you can control the movement of the walls, satellites in the space above that tell you all of those spaces. And then the last one, which is our newest one, which we're just in design for, is in Inner Mongolia. Probably the last place we expected to do a children's museum. But the fellow was golfing in Hawaii, and he was golfing with a fellow whose wife ran the Hawaii Children's Museum, fell in love with it, and decided this is what China needs. And so he has brought us over there to, in Hohhot, which is really a straight line from Tokyo to Seoul to Beijing to Hohhot is the capital of Inner Mongolia, where we're doing this children's museum. And they actually got a lot of teachers together and came up with this story here. That really the best way to understand yourself and the world around you is to start very focused on me, then your family, then your community around you in your city, then your country and the world. So we're taking that very literally here and developing a concept of these cubes on the corner of this street where every gallery is part of that story. We have a way you can go wherever you want, but you can also go through it, and each cube is a different color and a different part of that story. Exhibits about learning about yourself and your body, exhibits about learning about how you live in your family. There's a slight age increase as you go through, but we're essentially doing it so that anybody can go anywhere. So they're quite excited about this American invention that Boston is bringing to. We have several people from the Boston Children's Museum who are actually have Chinese backgrounds and are part of our consultants to this. And although it's very just black and white right now, our idea is to base the whole experience for the country on the mountains. They're nestled right in the mountains that separate Russian Mongolia from Chinese Mongolia, and so we're building mountains as kind of the ultimate climbing structure, so you actually climb from exhibit to exhibit. So this is a case where things that are inherently Boston, things that were invented here, interactions, science and aquariums and things like that, are brought to the global world. And then I sort of wanted to end with just an update on these same museums that we worked on for so many years and what they're planning to do right now. And because Children's Museum is open, so that's been the biggest thing. And this is sort of the Children's Museum, long before the ICA moved to its point, they were the same kind of pioneer in 1981 moving down here. And in fact, when my wife and I took our 1-year-old to the opening party, our car was stolen. So it was still a tough area. But one of the things what the new board said to itself was, this is a great place now. You can go in the children's room, you don't even know there's water out there. So the entire idea for this new scheme was to add 20,000 square feet to a 130,000 square foot building that's a new front porch. And so you can see as you zoom in, this building is essentially all glass. It does have a green roof, but it's entirely glass, light-filled. It gives more activities that are full body movement because it's bigger spaces. It allows them to have some changing exhibits, but it also lets them engage with the waterfront. The Harbor Walk now goes by here. And much the way we did years ago by putting a free seal exhibit out in front of the New England Aquarium, here we put 5 play areas that are free. So you can come and play at the Children's Museum whether or not you're going in. And our belief is when you prove you're a good neighbor, people respond. They're more likely to come than not. So this is the new front door. And then when you're inside, the front walls actually open up completely 2 stories high, so you can have activities and events that are both inside the lobby and outside on the plaza itself. So it's great on those really great days. The other thing we did here is only about half the exhibits are new, but we took a lot of the old classics, like the bubbles had disappeared up to the 4th floor back in the corner. We brought them back and made them front and center. So a lot of what we did was celebrate some of the early innovations that happened here. That's the Children's Museum, opened late in 2008. Since then, we've also done a master plan for the New England Aquarium, and we're implementing things over time. So this is the overall master plan diagram. Phase 1 was extending the pier at the end, adding the mammal pavilion out there, raising the Harbor Walk so it was suddenly an open space that was open to the public. It used to be their backyard, essentially their storage. They turned their back on the water. So this simple project actually now has made it one of the 3 most popular places to get married in Boston. They had 45 marriages the first summer that this thing was open. So it's suddenly this new public space that's open and free and shared, and there aren't really that many in the middle of Boston Harbor that just let you get out there on the end of a pier like this. So that's been great. This is the mammal pavilion in the middle here, and we actually put windows in instead of walls so that on both ends of the building you can watch a little bit of the performance for free, and there's even outside exhibits that allow you to get a sense of the aquarium and make you either enjoy your day on the pier or want to come in. The current project, which is phase 2, is the giant ocean tank, which is starting to leak. It's the glass is 40 years old, and we discovered that we really couldn't replace it anymore, and no glass people will do this anymore. And actually, the new technology is to use acrylic, which is clearer and much brighter. More light comes through it. And so the idea is we're going to take these open. This is a kind of computer section of the middle of that space right now. It turns out we were over-conservative 45 years ago, and the windows could actually be bigger. So we can cut the windows bigger. We're replacing it with acrylic instead of glass. We've taken out the rockwork in the middle and put new, brighter, more colorful coral and rockwork. And even more important, we've added another floor inside to the building. We've taken over what was mechanical and support space, extended the elevator up another floor, and put a ramp and an elevator to the very top. And so this whole top area allows us to have and we put a dome over it that kind of captures the rippling light. So there's another floor, even though we haven't changed the building. And to the left, you see the new education loft. We've created a platform in space there, kind of classroom size, with 5 new tanks and video projection, so the divers in the tank will have cameras, and we'll see their cameras on these walls up there. And we're surrounding the top with a new glass rail that wraps around the top, and it becomes the beginning of this trip. This is a Caribbean reef that most people don't realize is actually a real Caribbean reef. It's a specific place in the Caribbean where the aquarium keeps a boat and does research. So there's a real backstory in terms of what the aquarium does, as well as just the entertaining visit to a Caribbean reef. It's going to be going to open on July 3rd to the public. On July 1st, there's a members party, now called Reef Madness, for those in a certain era. And then finally, the last thing we're doing right now that fills up those first 3 projects is the Museum of Science, trying to tell a story of nature and technology working compatibly together. We've done a lot of technology has harmed nature. a lot of technology is now helping us deal with neighbors' issues. So nature, investigating the world and engineering the future is a new mission for them. And the idea is literally to split the museum in half with the natural world on one side and the design world on the other side, and look at how we're doing that. And there's a couple boards over here if people are interested. We've developed a 10-year plan, calling it a play in 3 acts. And each of the 3 acts have 4 or 5 areas of the museum that are going to expand. The first thing that will open this November is the new Hall of Human Life, a major new exhibit replacing the old health exhibits with well-being, still about your physical body and your health and your well-being, with all new technology that the museum is actually doing in-house. Second thing we're doing is renovating the lobby, new tickets, better information, and opening up as a better party space, actually. Then we're adding, taking the old classic dioramas of the New England habitats, making them interactive. Speaking of interactive. And a new intro, they're going to move Mathematica to a new location, and we're adding an exhibit design called What is Technology? And finally, the sort of cornerstone, the case study, is a new exhibit called the Charles River Gallery. And Yawkey has just given them $10 million to put in a new major exhibit in what used to be kind of leftover circulation space, but it's the one place where there's a giant window looking out on the river, and it's always bothered us that it's a little door that says, do not go out. So we want to engage the river. The museum has turned its back on the river for a long time. Architecturally, what we're looking at is greening the building. We intend to put a living wall around the entire garage, and green roofs on the top of the building, and actually developing a water cistern, which is part of the Yawkey grant, to collect water off the parking garage, use it for gray water for the toilets and for irrigation for all the new landscaping on the roof and on the plaza. And then the last stage, Act 3, is opening up bigger on the water side, re-engaging the river, having boats and tours and outdoor water lab, as well as some assembly and performance spaces on the river there. This is the new lobby looking out to the river when we open it up and take the big ticket booth and donuts out of the space. And so we're going to use that space to tell the story. And on the left, on the natural world side, we'll talk about the Charles River as a river shed, as an engaging space that it once was, as a salt marsh. And then on the right side, we'll talk about how technology and the care, and sometimes damage and sometimes care, in damming the river and creating locks and building retention wall, and essentially in the city of Boston growing up on the 2 banks of the river. And so this is kind of the case study for the Science Museum, the centerpiece exhibit that will lead you either into the design world or into the technology world, where you will learn in either one about the interdependence between both of them. So those are our 3 original ones, sort of growing back and continuing to evolve in the city. This will take, as I said, 10 years, but in November the 1st, and we're trying to pace them so there's always a couple special events every year of new things opening and closing, while still letting the museum handle 2 million people a year who pass through its doors. So that's my story, and thank you.
We have time for some questions, if there's anyone. Get the lights? Okay. Here, stay for a little while longer, so if anybody have any questions.
Yes. It's, we have been actually quite curious. I did, the last week in Baltimore was the American Association of Museums conference, and so there were a couple of people I met there from them. It does appear, we're not 100% sure why, and they're kind of quiet about why they're not just continuing on with the rest of his firm. It was, Softy did the original expansion. It's kind of considered the master plan architect. Then they hired Rick Mather, who's an American with an office in London, to do the next phase. They've announced a $650 million expansion. Although you have to remember, when MFA first announced their $500 million expansion, it was $800 million. And they were sort of very effectively, as they fell short, we still made it a success. So we'll see where they get. They've raised about $500 million. Mather's first project is a utilitarian kind of back of the house thing for about 30. He has a 35-person office, so we're not 100% sure why they're not going forward with him. It appears what they will do is just go back to the same short list they had before and select from that group. I'm not 100% sure who was in that short list, but I believe it's probably a nice time to get some breathing room too. They've announced they're going to postpone everything 3 years. So it certainly doesn't take 3 years to get another architect, unless they go through 50 interviews. But I suspect it's a good time to stop and take a look at what's going on there. Other things need to happen in Salem behind it, besides just the museum growing for it to be truly successful.
Where does the money come from to build a children's museum in Mongolia?
The donor is a self-made billionaire. He was sold by his parents because they couldn't afford him when he was a child, raised by some neighbors who had a dairy farm. So he learned the dairy farm business and was just the right age as a late teenager to become a capitalist. And so he was, just as China transformed, he became an agribusiness billionaire by 45. So he formed this, he's 55 now, he formed this foundation and he started, the Gobi Desert is advancing in Mongolia and it's being deforested. And so he started a foundation to reforest the Gobi Desert. Then the earthquakes started happening. So the foundation doubled up to deal with earthquakes. And the way he tells it, he got tired of foundation activities to fix things that were going wrong. And he wanted something to do as well to kind of start on a positive, proactive note, raising it. So his goal is to build 100 children's museums. We're being quite nice to him.
It must be exciting to see a city built from nothing in the middle of the desert.
It is. It's actually a little frightening too, because the first 40 buildings are well underway before they started our excavation, and they dug our holes before we were finished with design. One of the biggest problems is they got 4 contractors on the site doing the bulk of the construction, but any one crane will have to swing over 4 or 5 other sites to drop things on there. They've got about 35,000 workers on the site. In fact, the airport is predominantly workers flying in every week. And I was actually asking them, why are they still using, we've got some crane 19 stories in the air and some guy's spinning his arm or doing, I said, why don't they just use a cell phone? And it's because there's 9 languages on this site. And so coordination is really, but you can almost see it grow at the they're actually on site 200 architects now just doing the maintenance for just managing the construction. They have 30 more buildings that are going to come out. The Economist just had a article about it a couple of weeks ago. It looks like they're having real trouble filling it. So eventually the kingdom just has to tell people to go move in. It's actually I don't know what private-public means in Saudi Arabia, but it's not just a gift of the kingdom, like some cultural, most of the museums there are just the king has decided, or someone in the family. There's about 5,000 princes, 12 of whom kind of run things. And so this is the pension fund of the company, the RIC, the Riyadh Investment Corporation, manages the pension fund, whatever that means. So this is an investment project. Although they still haven't decided if the museums are free or if they're selling tickets. So we're building front desks. Yes?
When you make exhibits for like the Children's Museum or the Science Museum, do you like make prototypes and test them out on little kids? Or do you just go for it?
When generally what happens is after someone has won the bid, built into the bid is an identification that probably 5 of 40 will have to be prototyped completely, and another 5 to 10 will be prototyped in kind of cardboard mock-ups. So if it's an issue that the kids get it, or the sign's in the right places, it's a roof, then it's the cardboard mock-up. We'll do 5 or 10 of those. If it's, will this thing break? Was it even going to work? We did one where it was about how strong is a dolphin's tail, and we made these rubberized dolphin's tail with these handles, and it was in a tank, and you'd crank it, and we went through like 5 tails breaking. It took the entire job. before we finally got a tail that didn't break, and a contractor that almost broke. But, yeah, so we do have to do a lot of that. Sometimes, depending on how sophisticated our client is, our client's pretty sophisticated here in Boston because they've been around for 40 years. They'll do a lot of that themselves. And in fact, we're doing a new wayfinding system for the Museum of Science, and every time we send them a drawing, we get back photographs where they quick mocked one up and hung it next to the dinosaur, or put 7 of them on the main hall or something. And they're, actually, Museum of Science is in the forefront of, in spite of the fact that they still haven't dealt with their biggest problems, it's too dark, it's dirty, and nothing ever changes. That's always the survey stuff. They are at the forefront of visitor surveys. What takeaways do kids have? It's astonishing. Every conference, they are presenting the kind of latest things in feedback from an educational point of view. Yes?
I was struck by the Osaka Aquarium and the million-gallon tank that you have. And I'm thinking about the issues of earthquake engineering in that earthquake-prone zone. That must have been a very great challenge.
One of the wonderful things about tanks are their really thick concrete walls, and so we have all this stiffening. So we have great lateral bracing. Also, we tend to always have to go to concrete for an aquarium, and there's been a lot of tests in earthquakes now. If you build a concrete building, there were a bunch of hospitals in Mexico were studied, a concrete building will fail irreparably, but it'll take a while. So if you're in a concrete hospital, cracks will form, but you'll have plenty of time to walk out. You'll never use that building again. The steel building will start flexing and bouncing, people will be thrown out of beds, people will actually be killed in the incident, but you actually may be able to rebuild the building, not completely get rid of it. So the hospitals have to choose between people and buildings. As far as aquariums go, we're kind of in that concrete world, so it's inherently better. We're having problems with water rise, with ocean rise, because they tend to be right on the waterfront, they tend to be nearby. All our pump rooms and things like that are underwater. So most of our doors have like flip-up panels and for high tide conditions, and usually predictable. So in a storm setting or a high tide or a nor'easter kind of a thing, there's a whole prescription of things you do to like raise the door sills up 3 feet and things like that, and pumps to be put onto emergency power. So it's the water intrusions that's one of the bigger ones. Actually, New England Aquarium right now has a great little app that Untraveled Media did, where you can go down there and hold your phone in front of the aquarium and see it through the camera, and then pick what year the ocean rise is and see how far the water is around the pier. Nothing else? Thank you very much.